The International Monetary Fund is delivering a stark warning today, saying Donald Trump's war on Iran could trigger a global recession.
The closing of the Strait of Hormuz and serious damage to critical energy facilities in the Middle East raise the prospect of a major energy crisis should a durable solution not be found soon.
Oil and gas prices continue to surge in response to the two-way blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. The IMF has cut its growth outlook, with the UK poised to be hit the hardest out of the G7 countries. Let's bring in Justin Wolfers for his analysis here. He's a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. Professor, good to see you again, sir. I wonder, do you agree with this IMF warning that a global recession is possible if things don't get resolved soon?
That's probably the most dramatic way of selling their story. Their story's accurate. And let me just try and round it out a little more, because if we just go recession, that's not the whole thing. Basically they're saying that there was hope that 2026 was going to be a better year than 2025. And that for the world as a whole, developments in the Middle East have been enough to really put that on hold. And we're back from being optimistic to being a little bit more pessimistic. They're not saying for sure and for certain we're in for a recession. In fact, no one's saying that. But the more you slow the economy, the more you put yourself closer to recession territory. And let me add, recession may not even be the most important question here. That's an arbitrary line. The question is the world a little less prosperous today than it could otherwise be? And the answer from the IMF is overwhelmingly yes.
Well, look, when you look at gas prices, have gone up by as much as 70% in some places. There are protests in Ireland, that are disrupting the operations of the government. And you look at these warnings and you see the inflation potential that brings us kind of back to the post-COVID year, right? Where things just unlocked. I mean, how worried do we need to be that it goes beyond fuel, becomes food because of the fertilizer component here, and just the overall disruption drives prices up all over the place?
Well, let me try to be optimistic, but in a funny kind of way. For your viewers, settle in, because this is just season 2 of a TV show you've seen before. 2025 was a year of the trade wars. Mm-hmm. What is a trade war? The way an economist thinks about it, we call it a supply shock. A supply shock is when the costs of doing business go up. So we saw that as the main plot through all of 2025. The cost of doing business goes up. That puts inflationary pressure on, not just in the United States, but in other countries too. And it also slows the economy. 2026, war sounds very different. But there's one important sense in which it's very, very similar. Have a look at that economics textbook over my shoulder, and it'll teach you that that's also a supply shock. Right. The cost of doing business has gone up. So 2026 is the second year in a row of a supply shock, and it's a supply shock inflicted by decisions made in Washington, D.C. And so it means many of the ways of thinking about this that we got used to from last year will apply again this year.
So, look, it's folly, I think, in some ways, to try to get inside the mind of this administration on things. But if you look at the public pronouncements, that best case scenario with the Strait is they get back to where they were before the war, and we'll call that victory, a return to status quo, essentially. When it comes, do they know what they're doing? That's the question I have, because these supply shocks are choice, not circumstance, their choice, and that does not make anyone wealthy.
Yeah, it's a courageous question, mate, and I mean that seriously, because you risk sounding like you're not fair and balanced, but the reality is it's the right question. I've been saying for a while now, I think the biggest economic shock we face is not a supply shock and it's not a demand shock, it's a competence shock. That what's going on in the White House is a failure to look forward and think through the implications of their actions. I can give you 1,000 examples from the trade war, but let's talk about the war. We went to war in the Middle East without getting American citizens out of the region. We went to war raising oil prices without filling up the strategic petroleum reserve first. We went to war without really noticing that there's a tiny little kink in the ocean there that we call the Strait of Hormuz, which basically gives Iran the possibility of taking the world economy hostage. I think the US has failed at its strategic objectives, or I could think that if it had actually outlined some. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's a real Keystone Cops nature to this whole thing. Maybe there's a grand theory, maybe there's a just cause here, but it hasn't been articulated. But more to your point, much of the damage that's being done is unnecessary and self-inflicted.
Yeah, and done without any consultation with your allies, and then a demand that the allies help, something that they didn't want, they didn't start, and the very same countries that you've been inflicting pain on with your trade war, you're now demanding they help you in the actual war that you started that they didn't want. That's a tough argument to sell.
I feel your pain on that because I absolutely, our allies feel, and my friends north of the border feel left out and then taken for granted after, of course, you were told that you couldn't possibly be needed and you're all a bunch of wimps anyway. But yes, the norm is you talk to your allies. But now the sense in which I want to feel your pain is I'm on the other side of that border, but I am an American citizen. You know who else the president decided not to consult? Who else he didn't explain the case to, who else he didn't bring along is the American people.
In Congress.
What you have is a king in the White House making decisions about war. Funny thing is, last time I looked in the Constitution, it says power over war and power over trade both belong with Congress.
Right. So now, the impacts of the trade wars and this actual war stack on top of each other. We've seen gas prices, we've seen fertilizer, and the knock-on effects of those things. Are there certain products that we just might not be able to get if this persists? And even if it does wind up soon, how long before it just untangles? Because it took a long time with COVID, and this is as complicated potentially.
That's actually a really nice analogy, which is, sometimes your Windows computer, the best thing you can do is unplug it and plug it back in, and maybe it'll restart in a few minutes' time. And that's not really how economies work. And so there's already a lot of lasting damage that's come out of this. I think the most obvious is actually America's standing in the world and actually American security. The president, every time he says the word NATO, leans out and then leans in, and he's not quite sure where we stand on that. What you've seen, and there's going to be deep questions of, now that we are in a more hostile outward posture, what does America need to spend on defense? The president in his budget just asked for an extra $500 billion per year for spending on the military. And to put that in perspective, that's effectively a tax of $4,000 per American household per year. So he has, if that budget is a response to having made the world more dangerous, and that tax stays in for another decade, it's like, there's the family home with 2 cars out the front. The president's basically bombed one of them out of existence. We're a poorer country as a result of this. But
as a final point, Professor, before we let you go, I mean, if the world reserve currency, which America is adding debt at a pace that's exceeding like $1 trillion every 100 days, and taking actions that are flattening growth and disrupting trade flows, I mean, it seems to be the ingredients for a far more significant economic crisis in the medium to long term. Or am I misunderstanding this?
No, and that's the most important question, and the one I think our media environment is least well equipped to confront. I go on a dozen news shows a week where people say, are we in recession this week or next week? What's going to happen to next week's employment report and so on? But the really deep and important questions, the foundations of prosperity, are the institutions and the rules of the game for how we do political and economic business, and the ways in which we get on with other countries, the ways we provide security, the ways we respect the rule of law, the ways in which we re-elect the next generation of leaders. And it's those things that are being very slowly but very persistently undermined in a way that I've never seen before in my lifetime. And so I think the most important economic discussion we could be having right now is not what is next year's GDP, but rather, if we continue down this path, what is the set of opportunities that simply won't be there for my children? What great ideas won't occur? What new inventions will never be invented? What new industries and new jobs that my children could have worked in simply won't exist because we can't bring capital and talent together in exactly the right ways to create the magic that was the history of American prosperity.
Yeah, it's like a global Brexit, in terms of disruption. Justin Wolfers with the University of Michigan. We always appreciate the time, sir. Thanks for being here.